July 12th, 2023. Well, it looks like that we've completed the fifth week of the Ukrainian offensive, and the NATO heads, all the President Biden and all the other heads of state are in Vilnius, Lithuania, at the NATO summit. So that's kind of the topic for now. First off, I guess on the NATO summit, I think that's kind of going so far. We're about halfway through it. We'll see what happens in the last day, but essentially it looks like more of the same, strong commitment to supporting Ukraine forever in their conflict, and that someday they'll get to be a member of NATO when all the conditions are met. The biggest one, I guess, the war is being over with, because meanwhile, President Zelinsky of Ukraine is really upset, apparently, and complaining that he wants to get in NATO now. Now, of course, everybody should realize if Ukraine were brought into NATO now, he'd simply exercise Article 5 and NATO would be at war with Russia. And I don't think that they're all committed to do that, considering that we're running low on ammunition for one of the reasons we're providing the M864, I think it is, cluster munition artillery shells, 155 millimeter artillery that all the NATO countries have provided, is because basically we're running out of the so-called unitary shells, or your basic high explosive shell, and so they have to send them something. And of course, there's this claim that the Russians have been using cluster munitions, although I understand even Ukraine had been using some cluster munitions that they bought from Turkey previously, which is Turkey is a whole other piece of work in this subject. But anyhow, that's kind of the way it is. By the way, if you like these videos, please give me a like. We need more subscriptions. Thanks for those that have subscribed. And you can, of course, forward these links to these to anybody that might be interested. Yeah, and so that's kind of the situation there. Now on the war itself, of course, as I say, we've completed the fifth week. And I guess only a little bit more marginal progress than we'd seen last week, because most of the Ukrainian progress up to this recording, at least, has been somewhat marginal. I think there's been a little bit more progress in the area, both north and south of Bakhmut, than there had been previously. That's been kind of the focus of the last week in some ways, although there have been plenty of attacks in the south as well. But I think that just looking at the concentration of forces in the various war maps I can see on YouTube, there were so many brigades of Ukrainian troops around Bakhmut that I was thinking that sooner or later something big was going to start happening there too. And with the Wagner group being pretty much pulled out of combat and in a state of uncertainty at the moment, let's say, then maybe the replacement Russian troops aren't quite as fierce as that, and that does provide kind of a tempting opportunity. Although I think that it looks like the Russians are holding in there pretty good. I think they're bringing the Chechen special units in there now to back up in areas where there's been some problems. In the south there, in Zaporizhia the other day, there was a significant Ukrainian armored advance, and apparently led to something like 12 to 14 vehicles being destroyed pretty promptly. And then the next day, the Russians tried an attack in a different area, and south of Bakhmut on the other side of the battle there. And they similarly ran into a thing and apparently lost something like 9 armored vehicles. It seems like that just armored vehicle attacks in this environment is particularly small scale and simply leads to kind of a disaster because of the drone artillery, precision anti-tank missiles that exist now. Just simply makes those kind of attacks very difficult. So you're down to your classic infantry fighting, which it's also slow going and high casualty. So that's kind of it. Another interesting development in the last few days is it seems like the Russians are starting to move over a little bit to the offensive, particularly, well, that incident I mentioned before that didn't work out too good, but in the north, the areas north of Bakhmut, significantly north, up toward Kharkiv, which, you know, the Russians are out of that, but south of Kharkiv and significantly north of Bakhmut, in those areas, it looks like the Russians are actually beginning to advance and starting to penetrate through Ukrainian lines. And that may well be because the bulk of good quality Ukrainian troops are concentrated elsewhere, and also maybe that's. I understand also that there's a fair number of heavy armored units of the Russian army that are up in that area too. So it could be a mixture of those two things. It also could be the Russians just trying to do some kind of diversionary attack to sort of, force the Ukrainians to pull units out of their southern offensive to protect other areas. So it's an ongoing mess for both sides, I guess you'd have to say. I still tend to think, looking at what's going on, is that the exchange ratio in casualties is favorable to Russia, and the amount of territorial gains Ukraine has gained for it are relatively minor, at least as of now. So the other thing that's kind of interesting, of course, we're still kind of up in the air on what happened with the Wagner group and the mercenaries, because Prigozhin, of course, has showed up in Russia apparently in a meeting with Putin a few days ago. Now, some interesting things about that one. Of course, there's several things I run across, and I don't always take them all that seriously, but I kind of note them. And I noted that prior to the mutiny, it was reported on one source that I follow, which is probably a Russian favorable source, I'd call it. Other source I follow, Weeb Union, is kind of I think is a neutral source. He's from, I think, was it Holland or someplace like that. Anyway, but this guy, I think, tries to be objective, although I suppose his moral sympathies are with Ukraine, but he is an objective commentator. And so anyhow, but going back to this Russian source, had mentioned a meeting between Putin and Prigozhin about a few days before the rebellion, and then there was, or the mutiny, whatever you want to call it, and then afterwards he also mentioned that there had been a meeting between Putin and Prigozhin when he first disappeared from Belarus and apparently got back into Russia. And so what's kind of interesting about that is that, does this perhaps suggest that this really was some sort of a fake operation, a false flag kind of maneuver of some sort? I mean, I've really rejected that idea, but now I look at it, and what's really interesting is that after the revolt was over, there was the leadership, the military, defense minister and chief of staff kind of disappeared for a while. And there were rumors that Zelinsky, it was actually the former front commander at least, was arrested. And what's really fascinating about this is now first the defense minister shows up and apparently still in his job. And he's been seen doing things like touring their military production plants and meeting with generals and so forth. And then now Gerasimov has just showed up again. Now we'll interested to see if Shovikin will show up, or is he going to be the fall guy? The irony is he's the one person who seemed to take direct action to stop the revolt, and that he seems to be the one that's because apparently he's the one that ordered the helicopters into action to fire on the advancing Wagner groups that were moving toward Moscow. Well, if he's actually in trouble for that, could it be that in fact he was kind of odd man out and he's in trouble because he actually ordered his units to fire on the Wagner group, who were engaged in a pre-planned maneuver, let's call it, which led them to fire on the helicopters, losing several helicopters and pilots. And maybe, ironically, he's in trouble for trying to stop the thing rather than actually being sympathetic to it. It'd be kind of a twist on what's being covered in the media. Well, we don't know, or maybe he'll just show up tomorrow or the next day back on the job too. We just don't know. It's kind of interesting, though, that what's going on there. And what the Wagner group is going to be doing. I think the problem with them is that I just don't think you got to do something with these people. You got 25,000, people, and if you leave them in your rear echelon with nothing to do and no pay, they could cause some real trouble. So it seems like that the Russian government somehow has to get them back under contract some way. And actually entering them into the Russian army at the rank of private or even sergeant, I don't think would work very good either. I mean, the pay for that's a lot less than mercenary pay. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. Another development, of course, the other day, a Russian submarine commander was shot to death while out jogging, and apparently now I understand that a 64-year-old man was arrested for this. So I don't know who he is, what his relationship is. Is he? I'm thinking perhaps that just like the Russian ethnics inside of Ukraine, that may some of whom have sympathy for Russia. Maybe there are Ukrainian ethnics inside of Russia that have sympathy for Ukraine, and maybe that's what that is. We just don't know on that, but it is an interesting development that happened. And so, at any rate, that's sort of, I guess, the battle rages on, and we'll see how the NATO summit actually winds up, and and what they can promise to do in the future. Meanwhile, we'll see after the summit to what degree the Ukrainian offensive continues as it's been, or does it start to fizzle out? I'm not sure, but I mean, I think a lot of what happened might have been just to impress the summit of their commitment, but we'll see. Anyhow, I'll be wrapping this up for now, and I will post, of course, on Rumble as always, as well as on YouTube, and of course, the addresses of my social media accounts are in the description below. And until next time.